In the 1920s, factory girls painted watch dials with radium-laced paint and were told to lick their brushes to get a fine point. They glowed in the dark and slowly died, then sued the corporation that killed them. Radium had been isolated only 2 decades earlier by Marie and Pierre Curie, and by the 1920s it was marketed to the American public as a wonder substance, mixed into tonics, toothpaste, and even chocolate, sold on the promise that a faint green glow meant vitality rather than poison. The United States Radium Corporation put that glow to a very practical use, coating the dials of military watches and instruments so soldiers could read them in total darkness. The company knew radium was dangerous. Its own chemists and physicists wore lead aprons, worked behind leaded glass screens, and handled the element with foot-long tongs. The roughly 4,000 women who sat at the paint tables across 3 states were told something very different: that the paint was harmless, safe enough to put in their mouths hundreds of times a shift. Their lawsuit, when it finally came, changed American labor law permanently. The United States Radium Corporation operated factories in Orange, New Jersey, Ottawa, Illinois, and Waterbury, Connecticut, beginning around 1917. Their product was Undark, a luminous radium-based paint invented by the company's own co-founder, Dr. Sabin von Sochocky, and used to coat the dials of military watches, clocks, and aircraft instruments so soldiers could read them in the dark. The work was considered glamorous and remarkably well paid. Dial painters could earn nearly 3 times what a typical factory girl made elsewhere in town. Young women, some as young as 14, came from across the region to take the jobs. They were trained in the factory's specific technique. Dip the brush in the paint, put the brush between your lips to bring it to a fine point, apply the paint to the dial's numbers. Dip, lip, paint, dip, lip, paint. Workers did this hundreds of times a day, coating as many as 250 dials in a single shift. The paint tasted faintly sweet, almost metallic. The women took it home on their skin and clothes. They painted their fingernails with it for fun. They painted their teeth so they glowed in the dark and surprised their boyfriends on the walk home. The factory supervisors smiled and said nothing. The scientists at U.S. Radium Corporation, working in the same buildings, wore lead aprons. They used tongs. They worked behind protective screens. They had known for years, through their own research and published medical literature on radium poisoning, that the substance was hazardous. The women at the paint tables were told it was perfectly harmless. Within a few years, the women began getting sick. The first sign for many was dental pain that no dentist could fix. Molly Maggia, one of the original Orange, New Jersey dial painters, went to a dentist in 1921 for an aching tooth. He pulled it. The socket wouldn't heal. Over the following months, he pulled more teeth, and each extraction left an ulcer that spread instead of closing. By 1922, her jawbone had disintegrated to the point that a doctor examining her could lift the entire lower jaw out with his fingers. She died in September 1922 at age 24, when the infection ate into an artery in her neck and she bled to death. Her case was not unique. Teeth fell out. Jawbones rotted, a condition the newspapers called radium jaw, or phosphoncrosis, in which bone tissue literally died and crumbled from the inside. Several women had their entire lower jaw surgically removed. Others developed severe anemia as their bone marrow failed. Tumors grew in their hips, skulls, and spines. Some developed so much radiation-induced fragility in their bones that their femurs snapped simply from the impact of walking across a room. By 1927, more than 50 women employed at the U.S. Radium Corporation facilities had died. The company's response was to commission independent medical studies and then bury the results. When Harvard physiologist Cecil Drinker produced a report in 1924 identifying radium poisoning as the likely cause of the women's illnesses, U.S. Radium Corporation pressured him not to publish it. When he attempted to publish anyway, the company produced a falsified version of his report bearing his name, with his actual conclusions quietly omitted. They also told the doctors treating the dying workers that the women's symptoms were caused by syphilis, not radiation poisoning, hoping the stigma would keep the women quiet. In 1927, 5 surviving dial painters, Grace Fryer, Edna Hussman, Catherine Schaub, Quinta MacDonald, and Albina Larice, filed suit against the U.S. Radium Corporation. Grace Fryer alone had spent 2 years searching for a lawyer willing to take the case before a young attorney named Raymond Barry agreed. U.S. Radium's legal team was formidable, and New Jersey's statute of limitations for industrial injury was only 2 years, a window the women had already missed by the time their illnesses were correctly diagnosed. By the time the trial opened in early 1928, the women could barely hold pens to sign their own depositions. Catherine Schaub could not raise her arm above her shoulder. Several could not walk without assistance and were carried into the courtroom. Their bodies were failing in real time as they sat before the judge. The case drew national attention. Newspapers dubbed them the Radium Girls, and then, more darkly, the Society of the Living Dead. Their courage in pursuing the lawsuit, despite their deteriorating health, despite the company's enormous legal resources, despite a judge who granted repeated postponements that the women's own doctors warned they might not survive, became a national cause. Facing public outrage, U.S. Radium settled out of court in 1928. Each woman received $10,000, roughly $180,000 in today's money, plus a $600 annual pension and full medical and legal expenses for the remainder of her life. It was a fraction of what they deserved, and most of them were dead within 2 years. But the legal precedent they established changed everything. For the first time in American legal history, workers had successfully sued a corporation for damages from a workplace injury that took years to manifest. The principle that corporations owed workers a duty to disclose known hazards and could be held liable for concealing them entered American law. The Radium Girls' bodies remained radioactive long after their deaths. When researchers exhumed and studied the remains of dial painters decades later, their bones still registered measurable levels of radium-226, an isotope with a half-life of 2,600 years, meaning the women buried in the 1920s and 1930s will still be faintly radioactive in the year 3600. Their lawsuit did not end the industry's abuses immediately. A decade later, in Ottawa, Illinois, dial painter Catherine Wolfe Donahue sued the Radium Dial Company after learning of her own radium poisoning. So weak she had to be carried into the hearing and testified from a wheelchair in her own home, she won her case in 1938, a second landmark victory that further cemented the legal principle the New Jersey women had established a decade earlier. She died 4 months after the verdict. Together, the cases forced the development of new occupational health standards across American industry, including the eventual creation of federal workplace safety regulation. Radium-based luminous paint was finally phased out in the 1960s and 70s. The U.S. Radium Corporation closed its New Jersey operations in 1947. The site itself was declared a Superfund toxic waste site in 1983, and cleanup of radium contamination in the surrounding Orange, New Jersey neighborhood was still ongoing into the 2010s, nearly a century after the paint was first mixed. The women who painted the dials are buried in cemeteries across New Jersey and Illinois. Researchers who have exhumed their remains to study long-term radiation exposure still need dosimetry equipment near the graves. They were paid to make military watches glow in the dark, told the paint was safe enough to put in their mouths, and slowly died of radiation poisoning while the company that employed them hid the evidence for as long as it could. Even Marie Curie, the woman who discovered radium, would eventually die of it. in 1934 from a plastic anemia after decades of unshielded exposure in her own laboratory. She, at least, made that choice for herself. The dial painters never knew they were making it at all. The glowing girls who changed labor law forever. They sued when they were too sick to walk into court. They signed their own depositions with hands that could barely hold a pen. And they won. Not enough to save themselves, not enough to undo what had already been done to their bodies, but enough to change the laws that protect everyone who has worked in a factory since, the right to know what you are handling, and the right to sue the company that knew and didn't tell you. Subscribe if you want more. See you in the next one.